Money buys compliance, but it doesn't buy respect. Gideon Hayes had billions to his name and a 7-year-old daughter who terrified grown adults. Nannies quit in tears. Therapists walked out. Then came Frankie. She didn't want his money. She just needed a job. And she didn't negotiate with terrorists. The agency called it a high-priority placement. Frankie knew that was corporate code for a nightmare. She sat in the foyer of the Hayes penthouse, her sensible, scuffed loafers sinking into a hand-woven silk rug. The air smelled of expensive cedar and lemon polish. But beneath that, there was a tight metallic tension. It was the smell of a house where people walked on eggshells. Frankie checked her watch. She had exactly 40 minutes before she needed to call her neighbor to check on her 6-year-old son, Sidney, who was currently home with a mild fever. She didn't have time for rich people theatrics. Down the hall, a door slammed. Hard. A framed abstract painting rattled against the plaster. A young woman in a crisp white blouse came speed-walking around the corner, her face blotchy and wet. She carried a torn piece of designer luggage in one hand and a smashed smartphone in the other. She didn't look at Frankie. She just hit the elevator call button repeatedly with a trembling knuckle, sobbing quietly until the doors opened and swallowed her up. Frankie didn't blink. That made 15. Ms. Harding. Frankie stood. Gideon Hayes stood in the archway of what looked like a study. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit without the tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He had the kind of face that belonged on the cover of financial magazines. Sharp jaw, tired eyes, dark hair graying prematurely at the temples. He didn't look arrogant. He just looked hollowed out. "Yes," Frankie said. She picked up her canvas tote bag. He didn't offer his hand. He just turned, expecting her to follow. She did. The study was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the gray sprawl of the city. He sat behind a desk that looked like a slab of obsidian and finally looked at her. He took in her faded jeans, her plain navy sweater, the tired set of her shoulders. "Did the agency explain the situation?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, flat. "They said your daughter Beatrice has difficulty retaining care providers," Frankie replied. Gideon let out a short, humorless breath. "She terrorizes them. The one you just saw fleeing? That was a highly credentialed child psychologist from Switzerland. She lasted 4 days. Before her was a former military nurse. 2 days. Beatrice doesn't just throw tantrums. She finds out what people care about, and she destroys it." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I will pay you triple your standard agency rate, plus a bonus of $10,000 if you make it through the month. If you need a car, I'll provide it. If you need a live-in suite, it's yours. All I ask is that you keep her alive, keep her in the apartment, and keep her out of my office." Frankie looked at the man. He was trying to buy a wall between himself and his own child. "I don't need a car, and I go home to my son every night at 6, Frankie said. Her voice was calm, completely lacking the deference Gideon was clearly used to. "My rate is $30 an hour. I don't want triple. I want absolute authority while I'm on the clock. If I say she eats carrots, she eats carrots. You do not countermand me. You do not buy her an iPad to apologize for me taking hers away. Do we have a deal?" Gideon stared at her. He opened his mouth, likely to argue, but a sudden piercing shriek echoed from the hallway. It was a terrifying sound, the kind of feral scream that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Gideon flinched. He literally shrank back into his leather chair, rubbing his temples. "Do whatever you want." Frankie nodded. She walked out of the study and followed the screaming. She found Beatrice in the grand living room. The girl was 7 years old, small for her age, with a tangled mess of dark hair and pale cheeks currently flushed red with rage. She stood on top of a $300,000 velvet sofa, holding a heavy marble bookend above her head. Below her, the glass coffee table was already littered with the debris of her mourning: ripped books, overturned cups, a shattered porcelain vase. Beatrice locked eyes with Frankie. The girl's chest heaved. She was waiting for the reaction. She was waiting for the gasp, the begging, the frantic attempts to placate her. Frankie stopped a few feet away. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't speak. She just unzipped her tote bag, pulled out a lukewarm thermos of coffee, and unscrewed the lid. She took a sip. It was bitter. "I'm going to smash it," Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking. "I'll break the table." "Go ahead," Frankie said softly. Beatrice hesitated. Her arms were shaking from the weight of the marble. "I'll do it." "The table is glass," Frankie said, taking another sip of coffee. "If you drop that marble, it will shatter. The glass will likely bounce back and cut your legs. It will hurt. A lot. But it's your dad's table and your legs. So drop it if you want to. I'll get the broom." Frankie walked over to a leather armchair opposite the sofa, sat down, and pulled a battered paperback out of her bag. She opened it to her bookmark and started reading. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. Beatrice stood on the sofa, her arms trembling violently now. She stared at the new nanny. The nanny was reading. She wasn't even looking at her. "I hate you," Beatrice yelled. "I'm not particularly fond of you right now either," Frankie murmured, turning a page. 5 minutes passed. The bookend was too heavy for a 7-year-old to hold indefinitely. With a frustrated grunt, Beatrice lowered her arms, dropping the marble onto the soft velvet cushion beside her. She crossed her arms and glared at Frankie, breathing hard. Frankie didn't look up. She finished her chapter, dog-eared the page, and closed the book. "Are you done?" Frankie asked. Beatrice narrowed her eyes. "I'm hungry. Make me pancakes." "No," Frankie said. She stood up. "You made a mess. You're going to clean it up? Then I will make you a sandwich." "I don't clean," Beatrice shrieked, kicking the sofa cushion. "The maids do." "Not today," Frankie said. She pointed to the torn books and the spilled cups. "Pick up the books. Put them on the shelf." Beatrice stared at her, then deliberately lifted her foot and stomped hard on the spine of a picture book. She smiled, a cruel, practiced little smirk. Frankie didn't yell. She didn't grab the girl. She just walked over to the wall panel, pressed the button to lower the heavy blackout blinds, plunging the room in dim shadows, and walked out into the kitchen. She sat at the island, out of sight, and waited. 10 minutes later, a small face peered around the corner. Beatrice looked confused. Her audience had left. "Pick up the books," Frankie's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Or we sit in the dark all day. Your choice, kid." By day 4, the Hayes apartment felt like a trench during a ceasefire. Beatrice had realized quickly that screaming didn't work on Frankie. Throwing things resulted in the item being calmly swept into the trash, including a $300 limited edition doll that Beatrice had hurled at Frankie's head. When Beatrice ran to her father's study to complain, she found the door locked. Frankie had taken the key, but Beatrice was smart, dangerously smart. She recognized that Frankie was different from the others, which meant Frankie required a different strategy. It happened on a Thursday. It had been raining since dawn. A cold, miserable downpour that pounded against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Frankie was exhausted. Sydney had been up coughing the night before, and she was running on 2 hours of sleep and cheap diner coffee. She had left her jacket, a faded olive-green canvas coat she'd owned for 6 years, draped over the back of one of the kitchen chairs. Frankie was in the laundry room, washing paint out of Beatrice's play clothes. When she walked back into the kitchen, she froze. Beatrice was standing by the chair. In her hand was a pair of heavy kitchen shears. Frankie's jacket lay on the floor, the back completely sliced open in jagged, vicious cuts. The lining, a cheap plaid cotton, spilled out onto the marble tiles. Beatrice looked up. Her eyes were cold, calculating. She dropped the shears. Clang. Frankie stared at the coat. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was the only warm jacket she owned. It was the jacket she wore when she carried Sydney to the emergency room last winter. In the left pocket was a folded-up drawing of a dinosaur Sydney had made her, the one he said would protect her from the monsters at work. A slow, heavy heat rose in Frankie's chest. It wasn't the detached patience of a professional. It was the raw, jagged anger of a mother pushed to the edge. She walked over to the coat. She knelt down on the cold floor and checked the pocket. The scissors had sliced right through the fabric and severed the paper dinosaur cleanly in half. Frankie picked up the 2 pieces of paper. Her hands were shaking slightly. "It's ugly," Beatrice said. Her voice was a little higher than usual. She was nervous. She had found a nerve. But now she wasn't sure what the explosion would look like. Frankie stood up. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She looked down at Beatrice, and her eyes were entirely dead. "Go to your room," Frankie whispered. Beatrice blinked. "You can't." "Go to your room right now," Frankie said. The volume of her voice didn't rise, but the tone was absolute. It was a voice that held zero room for negotiation. Beatrice took a step back, suddenly looking very much like a small, frightened 7-year-old. She turned and ran down the hall. Frankie leaned against the kitchen counter, clutching the ruined drawing. She pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes, taking deep, shuddering breaths. She couldn't afford a new coat. Rent was due in 4 days. She had to tape Sydney's drawing together. What happened? Frankie turned. Gideon was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He was holding a file folder, his tie loosened. He looked from Frankie's pale face to the shredded jacket on the floor, then to the kitchen shears. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Christ, I'm sorry. I'll have my assistant wire you $2,000. Go buy a new coat, whatever brand you want." Frankie looked at him. The billionaire. The man who thought throwing paper at a wound would heal it. "Keep your money," Frankie said. Her voice was flat. She bent down and picked up the pieces of her jacket. Gideon frowned. "Don't be ridiculous. She ruined your property. I'm compensating you. It's just a coat." "No, Mr. Hayes, it is not just a coat," Frankie snapped. The sudden sharpness in her voice made Gideon actually flinch. She walked toward him, stopping a foot away. She didn't care that he was her boss. She didn't care about the penthouse. "It's the only winter coat I own. Because unlike you, I don't have an assistant to buy me a new one. I work 2 jobs to keep my son in an apartment that is half the size of your kitchen. And that piece of paper she cut through? That was my son's drawing. Gideon looked at the severed pieces of paper in her hand. For the first time since she met him, the hollow, detached look in his eyes cracked. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I can't buy that back," Frankie said, her voice dropping back to a fierce whisper. "You can't write a check for it. Your daughter doesn't need my forgiveness, and she certainly doesn't need your money. She needs consequences. Because right now, she's a miserable little girl who destroys things because she knows her father will just pay for the wreckage rather than actually look at her." Gideon stiffened. "You are crossing a line, Ms. Harding." "Fire me, then," Frankie challenged, holding his gaze. "Fire me. Write your check and go back to your study. Let the next nanny deal with the monster you are creating." Silence stretched between them. The rain lashed against the windows. Gideon looked down at the ruined coat, then at Frankie's defiant, exhausted face. He swallowed hard. What are the consequences?" he asked quietly. Frankie exhaled, some of the fight draining out of her, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. "She's going to sew it." Gideon blinked. "She's 7. She doesn't know how to sew." "Then she's going to learn," Frankie said. "And you are going to sit there and watch her do it." Gideon opened his mouth to object, to say he had a conference call, to say he was busy. But he looked at Frankie, and the words died in his throat. He nodded once. Frankie walked down the hall to Beatrice's room. She opened the door. Beatrice was sitting on her bed, her knees pulled to her chest, expecting a lecture, expecting screaming. Frankie walked in, holding a needle and a spool of thick black thread she'd found in the utility drawer. She dropped the shredded coat onto the floor in front of Beatrice. "Get up," Frankie said. Beatrice looked at the needle, then at Frankie. "I don't know how. I'll show you," Frankie said. "And you're not leaving this room until every single cut is closed, even if it takes until midnight." Gideon appeared in the doorway. Beatrice looked at her father, her eyes widening, waiting for her rescue, waiting for him to tell the nanny to back off, to say he'd already bought a new one. Gideon looked at his daughter. He didn't pull out his phone. He didn't look away. "Do what she says, Bea," Gideon said, leaning against the doorframe. Beatrice's lower lip trembled. The reality of the situation crashed over her. No money was changing hands. No one was leaving. She slowly slid off the bed, picked up the needle, and looked at Frankie. Frankie sat on the edge of the mattress. She wasn't angry anymore. She was just a mother, teaching a hard lesson. "Thread it through the eye," she instructed quietly. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the apartment was the rain, the awkward pulling of thread through thick canvas, and the quiet, steady instructions of a woman who refused to back down. The crude stitching on the back of the olive-green coat looked like a jagged black scar. Frankie wore it anyway. It became a strange, silent treaty between her and Beatrice. The girl never offered an apology, but the mindless destruction abruptly stopped. The throwing stopped. The terrifying, glass-shattering shrieks were replaced by a sullen, intensely watchful silence. Beatrice began trailing Frankie around the sprawling penthouse, keeping a careful distance. She watched Frankie scrub the marble counters with stubborn force. She watched Frankie balance her battered checkbook at the massive kitchen island, chewing nervously on the cap of a cheap blue pen. "Why do you not just use an accountant?" Beatrice asked one Tuesday afternoon, peering cautiously over the granite ledge. "Because accountants cost money," Frankie said without looking up. carrying a long column of numbers in her head. And I prefer knowing exactly where every single dollar goes. My dad does not know where his money goes. He just swipes a black card and boxes show up. Your dad has a very different life, Frankie replied flatly, firmly closing the checkbook. The real shift happened on a freezing Friday morning. Frankie's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, called at 6 in the morning in a total panic. She had slipped on the black ice outside their building and severely twisted her ankle. She could not watch Sydney. Frankie had absolutely no backup plan. She could not afford to lose a single day of pay, and she certainly could not leave a 6-year-old child entirely alone in their cramped, drafty apartment. She quickly packed Sydney's faded canvas backpack with cheap coloring books, a battered plastic robot toy, and half a stale sleeve of crackers. "We are going to my work today," Frankie told him firmly, kneeling on the cold linoleum floor to zip his thick winter coat. "You will sit quietly. You do not touch the expensive things. You do not bother the rich man. Is that completely understood?" Sydney nodded quickly, his large brown eyes serious and wide. When Frankie walked into the pristine penthouse with a small boy clinging tightly to her left leg, Gideon was already pacing rapidly in the foyer, barking aggressively into his cell phone about a corporate merger in Tokyo. He stopped mid-sentence. He slowly lowered the phone, staring blankly at the unfamiliar child. "My sitter fell," Frankie stated cleanly, daring him with her dark eyes to object. "He stays in the kitchen with me today, or I walk out that front door right now, and you can handle Beatrice entirely by yourself." Gideon looked closely at the fiery defiance in her exhausted eyes, then down at the small boy clutching a red plastic robot. "Just keep him completely out of the main study," Gideon muttered quietly, immediately returning to his phone call and walking briskly away down the long hall. Beatrice appeared like a pale ghost in the dark kitchen doorway. She stared intently at Sydney. Sydney stared right back, completely unintimidated by the luxury around him. "I am Sydney," he announced loudly to the silent room. "My mom says your big house is a fancy museum, so I cannot touch anything or we will get sued." Frankie winced, closing her eyes briefly. Beatrice blinked in utter surprise. For the very first time in her short, highly privileged life, another child was not looking at her with learned fear or forced, polite submission. He was just looking at her as an equal. "You have a robot," Beatrice pointed out slowly, taking a very hesitant step forward on the shiny tiles. "It is a transforming robot, but his left arm is badly broken." Sydney held it up proudly for her to see. The red plastic arm hung uselessly by a literal thread of torn, stretched plastic. Beatrice walked much closer, completely abandoning her usual defensive posture. She closely inspected the damaged toy with a highly critical eye. "I have heavy black tape," she offered quietly. Frankie watched silently from the large stainless steel sink as the billionaire's absolute terror of a daughter and her own worn-out son sat cross-legged on the heated marble floor, carefully taping a red plastic arm back together. There was no loud screaming. There were no arrogant, selfish demands. Just two lonely kids working together to fix something broken. Gideon walked into the kitchen for hot coffee exactly 1 hour later. He stopped dead in his tracks. His daughter, who regularly made grown, highly credentialed adults weep in sheer frustration, was lying flat on her stomach. She was peacefully coloring a bright green picture of a dinosaur with a strange boy wearing faded, second-hand sweatpants. "Pass the green crayon," Beatrice ordered sharply. "Say please," Sidney replied stubbornly, without even looking up from his rough paper. Gideon tensed his shoulders, bracing his entire body for the inevitable explosion. He waited for Beatrice to scream, to violently tear the paper in half, to throw the heavy box of crayons forcefully against the white wall. Beatrice scowled heavily. She ground her teeth together in deep frustration. Then she released a very long, heavy sigh. "Please pass the green crayon." Gideon slowly turned his head to look directly at Frankie. She was methodically wiping down the expensive silver espresso machine with a damp rag, completely unfazed by the absolute miracle occurring on the floor behind her. She caught his eye and gave a single, firm, knowing nod. Gideon poured his bitter coffee in absolute silence. As he walked back to his glass-walled study, the heavy, hollow look in his tired eyes seemed fractionally lighter. The ultimate test came exactly 1 week before the winter holidays. The massive penthouse was draped in professionally installed, wildly expensive garlands that smelled strongly like artificial pine needles and heavy room perfume. It looked incredibly beautiful and completely, utterly lifeless. Gideon's massive investment firm was desperately finalizing the hostile acquisition of a massive rival tech company. He had been locked securely in his dark study for 3 agonizing days, surviving purely on bitter black coffee and sheer nervous adrenaline. He had not seen Beatrice awake in over 72 hours. It was the highly anticipated night of Beatrice's prestigious winter musical recital at her elite private academy. It was a ridiculous, overly formal affair involving uncomfortable velvet costumes and a rigidly forced rendition of classical winter pieces. Beatrice was playing the wooden violin. She had practiced relentlessly until her small fingers actually blistered, driven by a desperate, unspoken need to finally be seen by the one person who truly mattered. At precisely 5 o'clock in the evening, Frankie boldly walked directly into the forbidden study. She did not bother to knock on the heavy glass door. Gideon looked up sharply from a chaotic spread of dense financial documents, his dark eyes heavily bloodshot and deeply rimmed with profound exhaustion. "Frankie, I explicitly told you I absolutely cannot be disturbed right now. The volatile Asian financial markets open in exactly 1 hour. Beatrice needs to leave in 20 short minutes," Frankie said firmly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Put on a decent suit tie." Gideon rubbed his pale face aggressively with both hands. "I physically cannot go. Tell her I am truly sorry. Tell her I will buy her that expensive horse she wanted. I will watch the professional video recording later tonight. My executive team urgently needs me to formally authorize this final strategic bid tonight, or we officially lose a massive $40 million deal." Frankie stepped aggressively closer to the massive obsidian desk. She did not raise her voice, but the quiet, fierce intensity of her tone cut cleanly through the low electronic hum of the expensive computer servers. "Gideon, listen to me very carefully." He suddenly stopped breathing. It was the very first time she had ever used his first name. "You have $1 billion sitting safely in the bank," Frankie said slowly, articulating every single word. "You can easily afford to lose $40 million today. You will completely survive. But if you do not walk out of this dark room right now and watch your daughter play that wooden violin, you will permanently lose her, not later, tonight." She sat on the floor and sewed my ripped coat, Gideon. She painfully learned that her harsh actions have real consequences. Now it is finally your turn to learn it. Gideon stared at her in utter shock. You fundamentally do not understand the intense corporate pressure I am under. I deeply understand that my growing son is currently wearing tightly squeezed hand-me-down shoes, while your daughter casually wears silk designer dresses. And I still somehow managed to make it to his elementary spelling bee yesterday afternoon. Frankie's voice finally cracked loudly, like a sharp whip. Do not ever talk to me about pressure. You are cowardly hiding behind your vast money because you are deeply terrified of actually being a real father. Stand up. The large room fell completely, dead silent. The rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the dark corner sounded exactly like a heavy sledgehammer hitting solid steel. Gideon looked desperately at the glowing monitor screens. He looked at the rapidly flashing red lights of his office phone. He quickly thought about the angry corporate board members who would mercilessly scream at him tomorrow morning. Then he looked deeply at Frankie. She was not just a simple household employee anymore. She was a brutally honest mirror, holding up the ugly, painful truth he had actively avoided since his sad wife quietly left them 5 long years ago. He slowly stood up. He reached over and deliberately pressed the main power button on his primary computer monitor. The bright screen went instantly black. Tell her I will be waiting in the car in 5 minutes, Gideon said quietly, his gravelly voice incredibly thick with heavy emotion. Frankie exhaled a shaky, relieved breath she had not realized she was holding. She turned and walked out. The grand recital hall was completely packed with wealthy parents holding incredibly expensive cameras. Gideon sat awkwardly in the 3rd row, right next to Frankie. When Beatrice walked nervously onto the wide wooden stage, her small, trembling hands tightly clutching the neck of her violin, she looked out at the massive sea of faces. Her dark eyes were frantic, searching. Then she saw him. Gideon gave her a small, highly awkward wave from his seat. Beatrice's tense shoulders dropped immediately. The tight, angry knot that usually lived in her jaw vanished completely. She smiled brightly. It was a real smile, totally unguarded. She raised the violin to her chin and proudly began to play. She missed 2 notes, but she did not care at all. Her father was finally watching. Later that cold night, after Beatrice was safely asleep, Gideon found Frankie standing quietly in the kitchen. She was packing her canvas tote bag, pulling on the badly scarred green jacket. Frankie, Gideon said softly from the doorway. She turned around. Thank you, he said simply. He did not offer a cash bonus. He did not offer a luxury car. He knew much better now. He just looked at her with genuine, profound gratitude. See you on Monday morning, Mr. Hayes, Frankie replied casually, a small, warm smile touching the corners of her mouth. She walked out the front door, the heavy metal lock clicking shut securely behind her. She was just a nanny making $30 an hour, heading home to a tiny apartment and a sleeping boy. But as she stepped out into the freezing city air, buttoning her stitched-up coat, she felt warmer than she had in years. The angry monster was finally gone. In its place, a real family had actually started to heal. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that presence matters more than presence. Family isn't about the money we spend. It is about the time we freely give. Subscribe to our channel for more deeply emotional, grounded stories about real people facing real struggles. Drop a comment below to let us know your favorite moment from Frankie and Gideon's journey. Thank you so much for watching today.